Wyoming Territory, July 1874. The wind was dry, the trail dust thick, and the girl they left behind was smaller than her shadow. Kessiah Pruitt stood in the middle of the wagon ruts, her calico dress grimy and torn at the hem, her hands trembling at her sides. She was 18, barely 5 feet tall, and the last words she heard from Uncle Roy were, "You'll slow us down. You ain't built for this." Then the wagon rolled on, the rest of the family not even turning back. She had no rifle, no food, no horse, just a cracked canteen and a satchel with a worn Bible and her mother's ribbon inside. She had walked 6 miles since sunrise with no real direction, the sun leaning close like it meant to burn her down. And then from behind a ridge of scraggly pines came the sound of hoofs. She dropped to the ground fast, heart hammering. But the rider had already seen her. He pulled up a few yards away, boots hitting the earth with the soft thud of a man used to moving quiet. Broad-shouldered, with a sun-darkened face and a clean red bandana tied at his throat, the cowboy looked down at her like she was something unexpected. His voice was low, steady. "You alone out here?" Kessiah pushed herself up, brushing dirt from her knees. "I am now." The man nodded once. "Name's Vance Vellner. I run a small herd down by Rock Creek. You get thrown from a wagon." "Left," she said, swallowing hard. "They said I was too small to help." Her voice cracked. "They said I'd slow them down." Vance looked at her, then not just glanced, but really looked. At the thin frame, the sunburn on her cheek, the way she stood as if she expected to be knocked down again. "You eat anything today?" She shook her head. He unhooked a canvas bag from his saddle and handed her a strip of dried meat and a biscuit. "Eat slow or you'll make yourself sick." He waited as she took small, cautious bites, his horse shifting behind him. When she finished, Kessiah looked up. "Thank you." Vance tilted his head toward his horse. "Come on. I ain't leaving you out here. I can walk. I got 2 eyes and a conscience," he said. "You get on the horse." She did not argue again. They rode in silence, her behind him, hands barely touching his waist. By dusk, they reached a narrow valley where a simple cabin stood near a stream. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney. Inside was warm, clean, and quiet. He lit a lantern and set water to boil. "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor. I can sleep outside." He looked at her like that was the worst idea he had ever heard. "You're staying inside. End of it." She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded tight in her lap. "Why are you helping me?" Vance poured hot water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Because someone should have." He made a stew from dried beans and salt pork. They ate by the fire, not speaking much, just the sound of spoons scraping metal. Afterward, he unrolled a bedroll near the hearth. "You safe here, Kessiah?" he said, voice quiet beneath the crackle of flames. "No one's going to leave you behind." Her lip trembled as she turned her face away. In the days that followed, she stayed. She swept the cabin, helped boil water for laundry, repaired a torn saddlebag with careful stitching. She was small, yes, but she was quick, strong in the way of someone who had always had to figure things out for herself. Vance watched her work with quiet appreciation. He never hovered, but he noticed the little things she did, how she folded his shirts with care, how she always made sure the firewood was stacked. One day, she was out near the stream gathering wild mint when he walked up carrying a small wooden box. He opened it slowly, revealing a pair of soft leather boots. "They were my sister's," he said. "She passed 2 winters ago. You and her got the same feet." Kessiah looked at the boots, then up at him. "You sure?" He held them out. "I would not offer if I was not." She took them, fingers brushing his. A quiet heat bloomed in her cheeks. That night, after supper, she sat by the fire threading a needle through a tear in her apron. Vance poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "You thinking about heading back east?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "There is nothing back there." "No one." He nodded. "Then maybe you stay a while longer." "I would like to." He smiled, not wide, but enough. The days grew longer. She planted a small row of beans behind the cabin. He taught her how to use a rifle, slow and patient, his hand on her shoulder as she steadied her aim. She laughed once when she hit the can on her second try, and the sound made something catch in his chest. One evening, a storm rolled in fast. Thunder cracked like gunfire over the hills. She jumped when it hit, and he reached for her hand without thinking. Her fingers curled into his. They sat on the porch watching the rain come down. "I used to think I was too small for anything," she whispered. "You are not small to me," he said. She looked up at him, eyes shining. "You do not see me like they did." "I see you clear," he said. "And I like what I see." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let it stay there. That night, she did not sleep in the bed alone. She curled into his arms on the floor near the fire, and he held her like she mattered. Because to him she did. She was not just a girl left behind. She was his beginning. The first frost came early that year, brushing the tops of the hills with silver. By then, Kessiah had learned how to mend a fence tight enough to hold against wind, how to skin a rabbit clean, and how to quiet a calf born too soon. Her hands, once soft and trembling, were strong from work and weather. The scars on her knuckles told a quiet story of learning the land by feel. Vance never spoke much when they worked side by side, but he listened. When she talked about the way her mother used to hum while kneading bread, or how the Missouri River looked just before dusk, he didn't interrupt. He just nodded or lifted his eyes to hers in that quiet way that said he was storing it all. One afternoon, she found him kneeling beside a broken wagon wheel out near the draw. The axle had splintered and he was dragging the iron rim clear of the brush. She joined him without needing to ask, squatting beside the cracked wood. "You plan to fix it?" He nodded. "Ain't urgent, but I figured it'd be a waste to leave it to rot." She ran a hand over the weathered grain. "Where'd it come from?" "There was a family tried to settle east of here 2 winters back. Lost 3 oxen to fever. The rest turned back. Left this behind." She looked up slowly. "You ever think about leaving?" His jaw tightened just slightly. "Used to. When I first came out, I thought maybe I'd make enough and head south, find land near water. But this place holds on to you." Kessiah rested her fingers on the rim of the wheel. "It does." They worked until the light thinned and the shadows stretched long over the grass. On the way back to the cabin, Vance paused near the cottonwoods and gestured toward a low ridge. "There's a spot up there I go sometimes. Brings a little peace if you want to see it." She followed him without hesitation. The climb was steady, the earth dry and firm beneath their boots. At the top, the valley opened below them, gold and rust against the sinking sun. A lone hawk circled far off, silent against the sky. "It's quiet," she whispered. "That's why I come," he said. They stood close, not touching, but the space between them felt warm. After a long pause, she glanced up. "Your sister. What was her name?" "Lena. She older. By 2 years. She taught me how to stitch a saddlebag, trap a fox, and lie to our pa just well enough to dodge a whipping." Kessiah smiled faintly. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have," he said. "She didn't let anybody talk her down." She nodded once, then turned her eyes to the sky. "I used to dream about being somewhere no one could tell me I didn't belong. You're here now." She looked at him, her voice low. "Because you let me stay." Vance's gaze held hers, steady and sure. "No. Because you made it yours." They lingered until the wind picked up, carrying the sharpness of oncoming cold. On the way down, he reached for her hand without looking, and she took it. Back at the cabin, she pulled the kettle from the hearth while he peeled potatoes at the table. The silence between them was easy now, filled with the kind of knowing that didn't need words. She set the tin cups down and sat across from him. "You ever think about building more here?" she asked. "A barn, maybe. A few more chickens. Something lasting." He met her eyes. "Not on my own." Kessiah folded her hands on the table. "I could help." "You already do. I mean more than that." He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. "Say it plain, Kessiah." She took a breath. I want to stay. Not just until spring. Not just until I find another way. Vance's fingers brushed the edge of the table. You sure? I've never been more. Her voice didn't shake. There's something growing here. Not just the land. Something between us. He stood slowly, walked around the table, and knelt before her, his brow level with hers. I see it too, he said. And if you stay, it won't be as someone I'm helping. It'll be as someone I build with. Her eyes softened. I want that. I want a life that's ours. He reached up, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. Then you've got it. She leaned forward and kissed him slow, certain, and without fear. When they broke apart, the firelight flickered in her eyes like a promise. That night, they made space for each other in every corner of the cabin. He carved a second peg beside the door for her shawl. She folded his shirts beside her own. Two people choosing each other without needing to be asked twice. And come morning, they began again together. By late November, the ground had hardened underfoot and the first snow clung to the north edges of the cottonwoods. Kessiah woke early, her breath misting in the cabin's dim light. She pulled on her shawl and stepped outside, careful not to rouse Vance. The air bit at her cheeks as she walked to the lean-to where two goats blinked at her sleepily from the straw. When she returned, he was standing at the stove, stirring cornmeal into a pot. You always rise before the sun now, he asked without looking away from the bubbling mush. I like the quiet before the world has its say, she replied, setting her pail down. And the goats bleed if I don't. He passed her a tin plate when the mush was ready, then sat across from her at the table. You ever think about writing your folks a letter? He asked between mouthfuls. She shook her head. They wouldn't read it. And even if they did, they'd say it was pride talking. You don't carry yourself like someone full of pride. I carry myself like someone who's done being ashamed. Her voice held no edge, just truth. He nodded once, not pushing further. Later that week, a rider came from the south, bundled in a thick coat. His bay horse lathered and fidgety. Vance watched from the doorway while Kessiah stood behind him, hands tucked into her sleeves. Vellner, the rider called. Got word from town. They're needing extra hands to help dig out the north road. Snow came down hard near the pass. Vance didn't answer right away. He was watching the man's horse, the way it stamped and tossed its head. Your mount's limping, he said. Stone bruise, I reckon. She's stubborn, though. Kessiah stepped forward. I'll soak her hoof in warm water. She'll rest better that way. The man looked at her, surprised, then nodded. While she led the horse to the lean-to and filled a small basin, Vance spoke with him low and short. When he joined her again, she was kneeling in the straw, one hand on the bay's flank. They're short on able men, he said. Might be gone 4 days. She didn't look up. Then I'll manage here. Firewood stacked, and I can patch the roof if it leaks again. You sure? I don't shrink from work. Her hand stilled on the horse's leg. I've already survived worse than 4 days alone. He crouched beside her. I'll come back sooner if I can. She met his eyes. Just come back in one piece. He kissed her forehead, a quiet brush that said more than any promise. That night, she sat by the hearth with a needle and a length of canvas, stitching sacks for flour. The wind rattled the shutters, but the room held steady warmth. She didn't mind the silence. It gave her room to think. She remembered Vance telling her once that the land didn't care who you were, it only asked what you were willing to do. She carried that with her, folded it into the part of her that used to believe she had nothing to offer. By the second day, she had fixed the broken hinge on the chicken coop and hauled water from the creek with a sled she fashioned from an old door plank. She wrote a list in her head of what they'd need before: spring seed potatoes, a new kettle, maybe oilcloth for the bedrolls. On the third morning, hoofbeats cracked through the cold. She stepped outside, rifle in hand, cautious but calm. When she saw Vance ride over the ridge, she lowered the gun and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He rode up slow, shoulders sagging with weariness. Lost 2 mules to the cold, he said, swinging down. But the pass is clear. She took the reins from him and led the horse toward the lean-to. You eat anything since dawn? He followed her, dragging his saddle behind him. Wasn't much to eat. Inside, she brought him a bowl of stew she'd made with smoked rabbit and wild onion. He ate without speaking, his hands stiff from cold. You hurt? She asked. He shook his head. Just tired. She poured water into a basin and set it near the fire, then helped him peel off his coat. He winced when he raised his arms and she saw the dark stain along his left sleeve. Vance, she said quietly, tugging at the fabric. Let me see. The cloth stuck, but she worked it loose. A shallow gash ran along his upper arm, crusted with dirt and blood. He met her eyes. Tree limb caught me when we were clearing the slope. You should have said. I knew you'd see it. He offered a faint smile. Didn't want to start with complaints. She cleaned the wound with warm water and wrapped it with clean linen. Her hands moved steady, but her jaw was tight. You don't get to fall apart, she said, tying the last knot. Not when I've finally built something that doesn't leave. His hand covered hers, his thumb brushing her wrist. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I've got reasons now. She looked at him then, her eyes full. So do I. That night, he rested with his head in her lap, the fire casting soft light across his face. She combed her fingers through his hair, slow and gentle, and he let himself drift, the ache in his body eased by the shape of her beside him. Outside, the snow whispered against the roof. Inside, 2 people who'd once been left behind now held fast to each other, building something no storm could undo. By mid-December, wind dragged across the roof with a long, low groan, and the days narrowed into thin slivers of light. The creek had crusted over at the edges, and the chickens refused to leave the coop. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of pine resin and smoke, and something comforting beneath it, flour dust. Wool, the trace of soap on clean skin. Kessiah had begun keeping notes on scraps of paper, planting times, how long the beans took to sprout, which corner of the garden got the most wind. She folded them into a small ledger Vance gave her after finding it in the bottom of an old trunk. Its pages were cracked thin as onion skin, but legible still. One morning, while she was rolling dough on the table, Vance came in with his coat dusted in snow, a stack of mail tucked beneath his arm. Stage came through, he said, setting the bundle down. Looks like some of it's been riding around for weeks. She wiped her hands and sorted through the pile. Most were addressed to folks she didn't know, but one envelope was heavy with grit and bore a name she hadn't expected to see. This one's for you, she said, handing it to him. He turned it over, eyes narrowing. From Kansas. She watched him open it, the paper unfolding with the hush of old news. He read slowly, his mouth flattening with each line. It's from a lawyer, he said finally. My father passed. Left a few acres near Council Grove. Nothing worth much, but it's mine now. Will you go see it? He shook his head. I meant to leave that all behind. Kessiah reached for the letter and read it herself. In the corner was a note scribbled in unfamiliar handwriting, a woman's name, different from the lawyer's. Who's Effie Darnell? Vance exhaled. Used to be our neighbor. Looked in on my sister when our father drank himself through the winter. I guess she's handling what's left. She folded the letter carefully. You could write her. Ask if there's anything worth keeping. Maybe I will, he said. But I won't sell the land. Not yet. Later, while she was mending the lining of his coat, he sat on the floor beside her, oiling the hinges of a trap that had rusted through in the first freeze. You ever think about what you'd do with land of your own? He asked without lifting his eyes. I'd plant apple trees, she said. My mother used to say you should always put something in the ground that'll outlive you. He looked up. I've never planted a tree. Then we'll start with one. The next day they rode to a trading post 2 valleys over. The trail was narrow, snow-packed, and lined with bare cottonwoods. Kessiah rode behind him, wrapped in a wool cloak Vance had traded for the week before. It was the first time she'd left the homestead since early autumn. The trading post stood low and wide, its porch sagging under the weight of snow. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of dried hides. Kessiah lingered near the back while Vance bartered for flour and lamp oil. She found a small crate near the wall marked seedlings, winter-safe varieties. She ran her fingers over the paper tags: chokecherry, plum, crabapple. When Vance found her, she held up a small wrapped root bundle. "Can we try one?" He looked at the label. "You think it'll take? If we keep it warm until first thaw, we can plant it near the creek." He nodded. "Then we'll give it a place to grow." They rode home with the bundle wrapped tight in wool and tucked between them for warmth. She leaned into his back, and he reached one hand behind to rest it lightly on her knee. That night, as the wind rose and the cabin walls creaked, Kessiah stood near the hearth, her fingers tracing the grain of the table where they'd pressed the seedling flat to keep it from freezing. "You ever wish for children?" she asked, her voice low. Vance was carving a new handle for the feed scoop, his knife working smooth through the wood. He paused mid-stroke. "I do," he said, "but only if they grow up knowing they're wanted." She nodded slowly. "I think about a boy with your quiet strength, or a girl who doesn't have to prove anything just to be seen." "I'd like that," he said. "We teach him how to stay, not run." She turned then, met his gaze. "You think we're ready?" He set the knife down. "I think we've already started." She crossed the room and took his hand. "I don't need a preacher to tell me what's been true since the first time you offered me water. We're bound, Vance Vellner. In all the ways that matter." He kissed her then, not urgent, but deep and steady. The kind of kiss that said the land wasn't the only thing that could hold fast. Outside, snow fell in soft sheets. Inside, they laid down beside each other with no distance left between them. And from the rafters, the little bundle of roots hung quiet and still, waiting for spring. In early April, after weeks of thaw turned the ridges soft and the creek loud with meltwater, Kessiah carried the seedling wrapped in burlap down to the low slope just east of the cabin. Vance followed with a spade slung over his shoulder, boots sinking into the damp earth. They picked a place where the sun lingered long, near where wild mint had begun to press through the ground in pale green shoots. As Vance dug, Kessiah knelt, unwinding the cloth from the roots with careful fingers. She didn't speak until the hole was ready and the roots settled in. "We'll call her Lena," she said. "Something quiet should remember her." Vance pressed soil firm around the base, then looked down at the sapling. She'd have liked that. Rain came softly that night, tapping the roof in a rhythm that felt gentle after the long silence of winter. Kessiah lay awake for a while, one arm draped across Vance's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the hush of water on wood. The next day, a wagon crested the far ridge, pulled by a sway-backed mule and driven by a man with a wide-brimmed hat crushed at one side. Vance met him at the fence line while Kessiah stayed back, watching from the porch. "Name's Elias Worth," the man said, tipping his hat. "I got myself a claim down near Muddy Creek. But the roof caved last storm and I'm heading for town to find a new beam. Heard you might have saw timber to trade." Vance nodded. "Got a few lengths in the lean-to. You hauling it yourself?" "Trying to." The man glanced back at the mule with a rueful shake of his head. "She don't pull like she used to." They loaded the timber together, and Vance handed the man a wrapped loaf of bread Kessiah had baked that morning. Elias blinked at the offering, then looked past Vance to where she stood. "You two run the place alone?" Vance nodded once. "Looks like you've done fine," Elias said. "Better than most." That evening, Kessiah sat on the porch rail while Vance sharpened a draw knife in the fading light. "More folks will come through now," she said. "Looking for help. Looking to trade. They're welcome," Vance said. "So long as they come honest." She watched the last of the sun slip behind the ridge. "I don't mind more people, but I don't want to lose what we've made." He set the draw knife down and walked over, resting one hand beside hers on the rail. "Nothing we built is leaving, Kessiah. Not unless we let it." She turned to face him, the wind catching loose strands of her hair. "I want to marry you." He didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He just stepped closer, one hand rising to brush her cheek. "You sure? I've known since the day you handed me that biscuit. I just didn't have the words then." He kissed her, slow and deliberate, as if sealing something old and sacred. They married 6 days later under the cottonwoods with only the creek and a pair of red-winged blackbirds to witness it. He tied a length of blue ribbon around her wrist, her mother's, while she whispered her vows low so only he could hear. They didn't write anything down. They didn't need to. In the months that followed, the tree took root. Its leaves stayed stubborn and green through the dry stretch of July. The goats birthed 2 kids and the hens hatched 6 chicks. Kessiah built a clothesline behind the cabin and planted a second row of beans. Vance added a porch swing with arms wide enough for 2. One evening, as summer began to lean toward September, Kessiah walked out to the tree with a tin pail and a folded scrap of cloth. She knelt and placed the cloth at the base, a piece of her first dress from the day she arrived. The hem was still torn. Vance came to stand beside her, arms crossed gently over his chest. "You keeping it there?" he asked. "As a reminder," she said, "that beginnings don't have to be pretty to grow right." He helped her to her feet, and they walked back to the cabin together, the sky bruised with dusk and the land smelling of dust and pine. Years passed, but the tree never failed to bloom. They built a second room onto the cabin when their daughter came, born in a spring thunderstorm with eyes shaped like Kessiah's and a cry that filled the valley. They named her Miriam after Vance's mother. Neighbors came and went, but word spread that the Vellner place offered steady hands and warm bread. Folks brought news, tools, and sometimes nothing at all but a worn-out story and a tired mule. The door was never locked. Kessiah taught Miriam to read by lamplight, her voice soft and slow, one finger underlining each word. Vance carved a cradle from pine and hung a chime above it that sang when the wind turned. Sometimes when the work was done and the child was sleeping, they sat on the porch swing without speaking, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting over hers. Nothing had been easy. Nothing had been handed to them. But they had built a life that held. And neither of them was ever left behind again.